Hello, this is Max. A former dealer has started a new life as a married architect, but everything falls apart when he receives a surprise visit from one of his former partners who comes bearing goods. Don't forget to subscribe. The movie begins in a Los Angeles convenience store late at night. Nick, a small-time merchant of the forbidden, sits inside pondering which flavor of coffee to choose. His ex-lover, Dallas, and fellow hitman Billy Hill grow impatient with Nick's indecision and urge him to make a choice. Ultimately, Nick selects chocolate macadamia flavor, but to his dismay, the dispenser is empty. He voices his complaint to the cashier, who suggests he pick another flavor. Nick reluctantly opts for hazelnut coffee and proceeds to the counter. While paying for his coffee, he insists on receiving a free cake, but the cashier explains that the complimentary cake is only available with a 20-ounce coffee, leading to a heated exchange. Dallas becomes increasingly frustrated with the argument and suddenly pulls out her handgun, fatally shooting the annoying cashier. Shocked by this sudden violence, Nick, Dallas, and Billy must now deal with the consequences of the shooting. Their situation becomes even more dire when they notice a police car approaching the convenience store. In a bid to evade capture, Nick decides to pose as the cashier while Dallas and Billy assume the roles of customers. A police officer enters the store to get a cup of coffee, unaware of the violence that has just occurred. The group manages to hide the cashier's corpse from the police officer for a brief moment, but the officer soon spots blood on the floor. Faced with no other options, they are forced to kill the officer as well to avoid being caught. This scene then shifts to Texas, where we meet Casey, a man who years ago was Nick's partner in dealing illegal substances. Casey has since turned his life around and is now happily married to Christine, with plans to adopt a child. One Thursday morning, Casey receives a call from Nick, who requests to stay at his place for a few days. Casey initially hesitates, feeling uncomfortable about Nick staying in his home, but he eventually agrees when Nick mentions that he is getting married. While preparing breakfast, Casey mentions Nick's impending visit to his wife, Christine, who is surprised as she has never heard Casey talk about his friend before. Despite her confusion, she doesn't have time to discuss it further, as she is running late for work. Christine informs Casey that she'll be home late that night due to a dinner appointment with her boss and reminds him about an upcoming appointment with Dr. Jorvis from the adoption agency. At 8 o'clock, Nick arrives at Casey's doorstep, and the two old friends are thrilled to reunite after such a long time. Nick asks Casey about his current occupation, and Casey informs him that he is now an architect. This revelation surprises Nick, who remarks that Casey seems boring compared to their past. Shortly afterward, Nick mentions that he has errands to run and requests to borrow Casey's car because his own vehicle has a flat tire. Casey readily hands over the car keys, and Nick departs. After Nick leaves, Casey struggles to focus on his work. As he passes by the guest room, he notices one of Nick's suitcases, which looks suspiciously like the ones they used for dealings in the past. Overwhelmed by suspicion, Casey eventually decides to open the suitcase and finds it filled with substances. Enraged by this discovery, he calls Nick and confronts him for bringing substances into his home. Casey insists that Nick must pick up his belongings and leave immediately. However, Nick claims he can't leave yet due to unfinished business. Casey threatens to involve the police and surrender the substances to them, but Nick remains unfazed. In a fit of anger, Casey takes the substances to the kitchen and disposes of them in the garbage unit. At 11:55, Casey hears the doorbell ring. When he answers it, he is surprised to see a pizza delivery boy. Casey explains that he didn't order any pizza, but the delivery person unexpectedly pinches him and holds him at gunpoint. The delivery person is revealed to be a Jamaican Rasta hitman named Dice, who is looking for the substances. Casey admits that he has already disposed of the substances, leading Ice to contact his boss, who orders him to eliminate Casey. After the call, Ice aims his gun at Casey, who suggests that they smoke together before his demise. Ice, unable to resist the offer, agrees. As Casey and Ice smoke together, Ice opens up about his aspirations to become a rapper and explains that he is involved in the killing business solely for the sake of money. They spend an hour consuming a significant amount of substances, and Ice eventually indicates that it's time to carry out his mission. However, just as he is about to kill Casey, his cell phone rings, and it's a call from one of his friends who asks him to perform a rap over the phone. Ice hesitantly agrees and begins delivering his rap. Seizing this distraction, Casey takes the opportunity to knock Ice down. He then uses duct tape to bind the hitman and confines him in his garage. Shortly after, the doorbell rings again. Casey answers it and finds Dr. Jorvis waiting outside. Intoxicated, Casey quickly clears away any remnants of substance from the table and sprays air freshener around the room before inviting the doctor inside. Dr. Jorvis is there to interview Casey and evaluate his suitability for adopting a baby. Although Casey is nervous, he does his best to answer the initial questions. However, Dr. Jorvis becomes particularly curious about Casey's past in Los Angeles, prompting Casey to try to cover up both his criminal history and his recent encounter with ICE. During the interview with Dr. Jorvis, Dallas unexpectedly arrives at Casey's house, under the impression that Nick has left some money along with the substance. Casey informs her that Nick isn't home and asks her to leave, but she disregards his request and enters anyway. Believing that Dallas is one of Casey's friends, Dr. Jorvis welcomes her and asks if he can pose a few questions to her. Dallas readily agrees and proceeds to reveal Casey's dark past. She describes him as a ruthless dealer who feared nothing and killed without hesitation. After hearing about Casey's dealership and murderous past, Dr. Jorvis feels extremely uncomfortable and decides that he will not approve of Casey's adoption. Despite Casey's attempts to convince him otherwise, Dr. Jorvis leaves the house. After Dr. Jorvis departs, Dallas holds Casey at gunpoint and ties him to a chair. She demands information about the money that Nick brought with him. Casey insists that he knows nothing about it because he left a criminal life years ago. At this point, the story unveils the reason why Casey abandoned his criminal activities. Flashbacks show Casey and Nick in the midst of a bad deal. This situation escalates into a shootout between the two parties involved. Overwhelmed by guilt and haunted by the memory of unintentionally killing a pregnant woman during a deal gone wrong, Casey had chosen to leave his criminal life behind. Dallas mocks his story and plans to wait for Nick to arrive by hitting on Casey. Despite Casey's insistence that he is a married man, Dallas continues to do so. However, their encounter is abruptly interrupted when Billy enters the scene, shooting Dallas from behind and splattering blood all over Casey's face. Billy, like Dallas, is also after the money that Nick is rumored to have stolen. He believes that Casey knows the money's location and intends to torture him into revealing it, using tools like a saw and a blowtorch. While boasting about his torture techniques, they hear the sound of police sirens approaching. Billy decides to hide his tools and investigate, and Casey takes advantage of the moment to loosen the duct tape around his wrists and grab a frying pan. When Billy returns and notices the duct tape on the floor, Casey strikes him multiple times with the frying pan until he's knocked unconscious. Casey then retrieves a handgun but hesitates, realizing that he's not the same person he used to be. Instead of killing Billy, he takes him to the garage and ties him upside down, mirroring what he did with ICE. Shortly after, Nick calls Casey from a payphone, apologizing for everything and revealing that he had stolen the substances and money from the police. Casey senses that something is wrong due to Nick's breaking voice and tries to inquire further, but Nick simply mentions that he's leaving the country and says goodbye. As they hang up, it becomes evident that Nick has been shot and is dying from blood loss. Casey proceeds to clean himself up and restore some semblance of order to his blood-splattered home. At 5 o'clock, a corrupt cop named Kasparov arrives at Casey's house, carrying a bag containing Nicky's remains. Kasparov reveals that Nick had stolen the money from him. Kasparov, like Dallas and Billy, questions Casey about the money's whereabouts, but Casey maintains that he has no knowledge of it. Kasparov expects Casey to know where Nick would have hidden the money and gives him an ultimatum: find the money by 7 p.m., and he will erase all records of the Thursday incident, including the dead body and the two captives in Casey's garage, whom he is well aware of. Casey leads Kasparov to the garage, where the corrupt cop wastes no time in ruthlessly shooting the hanging captives to death. He then instructs Casey to dispose of their bodies on garbage day. Once Kasparov leaves, Casey continues cleaning his house and follows the cop's suggestion to mutilate the dead bodies and place them in the trash can outside. On his way back to the house, Casey notices Nick's car parked outside and remembers the flat tire issue Nick had mentioned earlier. Upon inspecting the car, Casey discovers the money hidden in the spare tire. He also finds a small gift box left by Nick, containing 2 watches, one for Christine and the other for himself. In the aftermath, Casey takes Ice's phone and calls Ice's boss, informing him that the substances will be auctioned off at his home at 7 p.m., effectively setting a trap between the Jamaican gang and Kasarov's corrupt cops. As Casey orchestrates the deadly confrontation between the Jamaican gang and Kasarov's corrupt cops, he grabs the suitcase filled with money, hops into Dallas's Lamborghini, and rushes to pick up his wife. At 7 p.m., the meeting at Casey's residence turns into a violent shootout, with the Jamaican gang and corrupt cops opening fire on each other, just as Casey had planned. Meanwhile, Casey meets Christine at the airport. She is surprised to see him there and asks about his actions. Casey tells her that he is leaving for France and wants her to join him. Christine realizes that Casey has gotten himself into trouble, and she is torn between her career and her love for him. Uncertain about what to do, she finally decides to go with him, stopping Casey from leaving alone. She expresses her willingness to accompany him and asks for the details of the situation. Casey agrees to tell her everything on their way. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen, and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.